The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings to the viewers of the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. And greetings here to the first viewers, Loud to Zoo, Sister Robin, Brother Ugawa, Greg West, Stephen McKenzie, James Limba, and others that I assume will be coming on soon. So this is another show that I always say it's a special show. My wife says, you always say it's a special show. Yeah, for each one it is. To Brother Duzi Magwaza and Siobhan B. Greetings to you as well. Christopher Clipper. How's everybody doing? You okay? For the last 3 weeks, we've had the pleasure of having Dr. Julius Garvey on in a 3-part series. He is the youngest son of Marcus Mosiah Garvey and Amy Jock Garvey. And he's 89 years old, a heart surgeon and throat surgeon, and was practicing medicine for 50 years, and is a real advanced thinker, balanced in just about all areas, spiritually, culturally, politically. He's up on a lot of things that are happening now, now in terms of Afrocentric thought. It was just a real pleasure to have him engaging in a discussion. So people who haven't viewed this series, you should. And pick up his book. When you look at the shows, they'll show you how to get it. Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey It's the revised version suited for young people right now. So check him out. We had a lot in common, and 2 of the 3 in the series involved some cinematography. They cost some money, by the way, background historical material. So check that out also. I want to thank all the viewers who have donated to the show. We need your financial support. And a number of people have ordered books, and they will be going out this week. I've been doing a lot of different things, so I will be getting those out. And I appreciate people ordering the books. So today's show is part 1 of a 3-part series. You know, I do a lot of series on these shows. So as the notice that went out shows, today's show is entitled Aryanism, the Philosophy that Inspires United States Imperialism. And this is the circular that went out showing that. Of course, this could also be entitled Aryanism, the Philosophy that Inspires British imperialism, French, German, all of them, you know. And then you could go back and talk about the Romans and the Greeks and everything else. But I'm focusing today particularly on U.S. imperialism because it is trying to rule the roost on the planet. And so it's timely to discuss the American component of imperialism, which means the move by one country to dominate and control another or others. And in this case, it means the move of the United States to dominate the world. You understand? So part 1 today is going to focus on how Aryan philosophy inspires United States imperialism. And you'll see why I'm focusing on the Aryan, not excluding other influences on imperialism, such as capitalism, for example, and obviously such as racism. So that's the title, and that's what this series is going to be covering. And I'm an innovator, which means that I deal with coming up with new thought. So I'm not repeating what others have done, though you'll see in a minute, I've apprenticed under masters, and one in particular influenced my orientation around Aryanism. Though I've gone and done my own research, this person has been a very important influence on me. But generally, I'm not repeating the same old stuff that you already know. I mean, I'll cover it every now and then. For example, in these shows, I've gone to early Kemet, preceding the First Dynasty. Not because I don't think the First Dynasty is important. It is. Some people say 3200 or 3300 BC. But it's the ancient period that people refer to and just move on and don't study. So my focus especially is on the Anu, A-N-U, who are the founders of ancient Kemet through Asar. So this is, going back to roots. And then in terms of history, as people know, just as I've done a series on the Anu, the foundational focus in African history, ancient African history, are the world's first people, the Twa. Technically, the San people or Kung people of Kalahari Desert, which mitochondrial DNA shows are the world's first people. They give birth to civilization, the highest form in the history of the world. So when I'm dealing with the issue of the philosophy of Aryanism and its influence on U.S. imperialism, I'm going back again to roots. And so in this case, the roots of what you call European people. So this is me. I'm trying to do stuff that hasn't been covered. And as people who've watched this show know, take the past and apply it to the present. And that is really key. And that's also why I've linked the issue of Aryan philosophy with United States imperialism. So we're not just dealing with the ancient past and the origin of what people call Europeans, but we're dealing with the application of Aryanism to present day history and politics and reality. Good question is, so why am I locating the motivation of U.S. imperialism, and you could say Western imperialism in general, or the drive of the U.S. to dominate the world to Aryanism? And as you'll see as we go into this discussion, I'll be going into what Aryanism is. Some people watched the show before. I've dealt with this somewhat, but I'm going into more depth now. And most of this comes from the book that I'm finishing. I'm at 658 pages on Seba. To know the truth is to be the truth. And this is a replacement system of education. I'm revolutionary. So I do systems, free the mind. So some of y'all that want to get into the webinar that will be a year-long, twice-a-month webinar, myself and a brother named Bulanlela Wabogo are the only people who have uncovered the stages you go through when you're waking up. You want to talk about some real healing? That is the ultimate stuff. It won't heal you from mental illness. You need to go to a psychologist for that. But a lot of what's called mental illness is caused by societal imbalance. And if this society was run by people who were whole and humanistic, we wouldn't see a lot of the crime or mental disorders that we see, or breakdowns. Because if you have breakdowns in society, you're going to have breakdowns in the mentalities of people, in their spirits, and in everything else. So this focus is on Aryanism for a very specific set of reasons. First, it's incorrect from a historical standpoint to, when you're dealing with the origin of whites, or what you call Europeans, to locate this within Europe. That is, within the definition of Europe. Where the people live, that's correct. But the term Europe is a recent term. The Romans, the Greeks, and many others precede them, and the Aryans are the first. And Europe is a recent term and a recent concept. And for many historians, they say it's an idea that hasn't been realized. And if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, if you really knew what was going on there, you'd understand it better. Because Western Europeans don't really like Eastern Europeans. And they really don't like Russians. And you're going to see what role both of them played in Aryanism in a minute. So if you are locating the drive for world conquest among what you call white people, you got to be careful with that term too, because there are whites who are not Aryans. Some Arabs are white in complexion, they're not Aryans. The Turks, some of them are, they're not Aryans. So, I know we just like black and white categories, but it's incorrect from a historical standpoint when dealing with history and you're dealing with the origin of a thing to deal with the fruit rather than the root. Europe is a fruit, but the root is Aryanism. So it's correct to go back to the root, to the beginning of where these people that you call Europeans or Euro-Americans or white people began, and to look at their thought pattern, their culture, their philosophy, and their history. And by the way, I'm a warrior, so I fought many of these Aryans, corporate, CIA, FBI. I beat all of them. I don't have an exaggerated focus on white people. I wrote a book called Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. There's only one chapter in there on white people. I know we're predisposed to that. But as a warrior, I know you got to know yourself and know your enemies. So it's important. But it's not of central importance to me. But knowing them is very important. But it's not of central. I don't wake up thinking about white people. I stress them. They don't stress me. You know what I mean? So, but it's still important. So we need to go to the root of what we call Europeans. And here what I want to do is pay respect to my master who's passed on, Dr. Jacob Carruthers, who was one of the masters I apprenticed under, a little brother, deep voice, very serious. His best book is Medu Neter. And then he's written a master work, one of the two, now I think 3 best works on the Haitian Revolution, Irritated Genie. And he's written on the struggle between Afrocentrism and Eurocentrism, which is quite good, and a couple of other books. He's a master. And my masters have generally matched me. That is, they're people that have interests similar to mine, but they're more developed than me. And they also, almost all of them, have a political focus. So Dr. Carruthers was a historian, a philosopher, and his degree, his PhD, was in politics. He joked about it because when I brought my book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, in a draft form for him to review, and this is around 1983, this book was rated #1 against all books on Malcolm X in the New York Times by Michael Eric Dyson. He jokingly, because he was humble, he told me what his PhD dissertation was on. And it was on Gandhi. So in fact, Dr. Carruthers, when he went to the Center for Inner City Studies in Chicago, he was really an integrationist in his thinking until a brother named Dr. Andy Thompson had an influence on him. And he says he Africanized him. And they had both passed on to the other side. Dr. Anderson Thompson was a political scientist. He didn't write, but he was a deep thinker, you know. So thanks to Andy Thompson, he was able to root Dr. Carruthers, who always said, I'm Jake from Chicago, by Texas, in blackness. And so he became what you call a hardliner, meaning somebody who really stood up for African people. I've been described as the same thing by some people. So I want to start this with Why the Aryans by quoting from Dr. Carruthers. Now, I've taken my research well beyond what I gained from him, but I want to give credit to my master who put me on this path, a brother who I love deeply, a kind and humble brother who had a real deep voice. And when he gave you a critique, because I asked for critiques and he didn't believe most Black scholars wanted critiques, then when he gave it to me, he'd say in his deep voice, you're a little guy, but he had a real serious deep voice. You asked for it, didn't you? And then that was my oh shit moment. And I had to go back and tighten stuff up. That only happened one time, by the way. So this is what Dr. Carruthers has to say about the Aryan and why it's important to focus on the Aryan. Quoting from him, and this is from an unpublished manuscript that he allowed me to have, published in 1982. I assume that his lovely wife is going to eventually published this in book form, quoting from Dr. Carruthers. Linguistic, cultural, and biological data suggest that the Northwestern Europeans who have dominated the world for the past 500 years are of the same stock as the Aryan Indians and Greeks of antiquity. In antiquity, these people identified themselves as Aryas or Aryans, which means lords or master people. Okay, lords or master people. And one of the things you need to ask as we talk about the isms, capitalism, feudalism, and all the other isms, mercantilism, nomadism, all these different systems that have an economic base to it. Does this lord and master fit within it? Ask yourself that question. Now he goes on and says, since that cultural motif of lord and master has survived from prehistoric to contemporary times, it is appropriate that we recognize the Aryan people and culture as properly including the people who inhabit the Eurasian continent. In case you don't know, there is no continent called Europe. Europe's a part of Asia. So Eurasia is just describing that little small part of Asia that's Europe, Eurasia. You would think it was some big place. It isn't. Go to any part of Europe and you can get to any other part as quick as I can get from Oakland to Los Angeles, in some cases quicker, you know? And so it's people in this little landmass that had a big impact on the world. Of course, the Russians don't have a little landmass. So he is locating then what's called the European in a linguistic, cultural, and biological context. Biological, meaning white. Linguistic, their language group. Culture, their cultural group. And he's locating it with the various people that today are called Europeans, but he adds to them the Iranians, who were then in ancient times called Persians, the Indians, particularly the Indo-Aryans, because the original Indians were African. Dalits, as they prefer to be called now, or Dravidians, as they were called before. These are the founders of India. So when we talk about Aryan, then we're talking about a geographical area that includes Northern Europe, Western Europe, Eastern and Southern Europe. It includes the Greeks, it includes the Persians, and it includes the Aryans. And the Indo-Aryans, that is the whites who conquered India. The Aryans, they'll tell you that, even though a lot of them are brown skinned, because when they came in and conquered India, they didn't have women. They came as nomads. So they intermarried with the Africans. So a lot of them have dark complexions. Some of them do not. But they all will tell you they're Aryan. If you watch Fareed Zakaria on CNN, he will tell you he's an Aryan. And every now and then he'll get a real good white nationalist and they tell him, no, you aren't. But he's talking about his roots. And I don't have time today to go into the Gita, the holy book of India, but most of you don't know the difference between Aryan thought and African thought. So you think, because you hear a lot of stuff in that book, it's a great book in many ways, that's deeply spiritual. You don't know the part that's Aryan, deeply Aryan. And that's the mixed bag of the Gita and of the spirit, political, social, economic system of India. I'm not going into that today. But the point is, the Indo-Aryan, those are the Aryans who conquered India. Now, what I first want to do is go into, where does this culture come from? What's its geographical origin. This is real key. And then go into other qualities of the Aryan culture. So this is a key thing, because today you got a war going on between Russia and Ukraine that the U.S. is heavily responsible for. I'm not going into that today. If you knew your history, you'd know that automatically. But if you listen to the propaganda, you wouldn't know. America surrounded Russia. Since the breakup of the Soviet Union, recruited former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics into NATO and put them right on the border of Russia, and then played politics with Ukraine. And those politics have helped set up what's going on with this war. This war didn't have to happen. Now, Russia's at fault for invading, but America set the conditions for that. And I'm not going into that today. That would require a whole show. But the key point is, guess what? When you deal with the origin of the Aryan, and most of our scholars who deal with this nomadic thing have not got this right, then you are dealing with southern Russia, Ukraine, and the Caucasus Mountains. The Aryan comes out of those areas: southern Russia, Ukraine, and the Caucasus Mountains. They represent a linguistic group, and I'll give a surface thing on the linguistics. In my book on Seba, I go into detail on the meaning of different words coming out of the Aryan language. I'll only focus on one here, identifying their worldview. And so they're made up of different tribal groups that shared over time a common culture, a common language, and a unique philosophy, a distinct social structure, and a unique economy. So the Indo-Aryan have a distinct linguistic group. And if you go and look at it, you'll see that all these other groups that are called European today, the Greek, the Roman, the Iranian, the Aryan in India, the Indo-Aryan, the British, the French, the Germans, and so forth, they all come out of this common linguistic group. And so values are conveyed through their language. I'll give a few examples today. They have a common culture. And this common culture is a culture tied very much to their social structure, which is a social structure centered on men, patriarchy, that has no value for women. And its unique culture is a culture of war, a culture of war, beginning in nomadism, nomadic culture. So this is the beginning of this. As nomads, its unique economy was heavily based on preying on other people and getting what they had. Now, the Arab had something very similar in Saudi Arabia. When I brought my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, to John Henry Clark as a gift, because he had written one of the two introductions, he gave me a book. He was blind as a bat. He knew where all the 25,000 books were in his library. He gave me a book and sent me upstairs in his house to read a section on the Arab. And it was basically about how, coming out of a desert environment, they preyed on others. That was their economy. But there's a big distinction between the Arab and their view of life, including how they approached earning a living, what it was based on, and the Aryan. The Arab had a notion called group feeling. The power of the Arab group is based on the power of the kins of the same bloodline, or the people under the same tent. So it's very much family-based in that sense. It is patriarchal, but it comes from a different thing. Whereas the Aryan has an ethos that is similar but different. Similar but different. So the Aryan has a unique philosophy, and that philosophy is very much rooted in warfare, but it is also rooted in the Aryan self-definition. So when I get into the definition of what it means to be Aryan, there you will have the core of their philosophy. Now, around 5000 BC, we have evidence of the Aryans emerging, who are conquerors in the steppe regions of the area of Russia, north of the Black Sea. These conquerors came from the Volga Basin. The Volga Basin is the largest river in Europe. It's over 2,000 miles long. And so this is their origin. And it's around 5000 BC, you see the emergence of this distinct culture. And why am I focusing on this? Because it's at the foundation of the so-called European today. And it is the foundation of the so-called Euro-American. So you're going to understand then, you really need to understand this root, because there are certain behavior patterns, thought patterns, attitude patterns that you find in the Aryan that arise in all these groups. And if you're just looking at racism, you'll miss it. And if you're just looking at capitalism, and capitalism is important to list, and I'm opposed to it, it's a vicious, oppressive system that enriches the very few and impoverishes just about everybody else. I know some of you identify with this system. It's no good, you know. And it has an Aryan impulse at its foundation. And I'll go into this one in a minute. Now, there were three waves of Aryan conquerors. Wave 1, 4400 to 4300 BC, coming out of Russia, Ukraine, the Caucasus Mountains, and going into other parts of the world. One of the first is India. And so this is wave 1, 4400, 4300 BC, before Christ. Wave 2 of this group of people comes around 3500 BC. And wave 3, 3000 BC. Now notice Kemet, as a dynastic culture, technically comes into being around 3200. But these Aryans don't have any real impact on Africa at this point. Now, there are some key common characteristics of these Aryans that distinguish them from other people in this early period of history, going back 5000 BC, going down to 3000 BC. And what is it? The burial remains that you find of them show that they engaged in warfare. And so what do you have as proof of that? You have thrusting and cutting weapons, those that you would throw, those that you would stab with. And they're developing bronze technologies and other technologies to use these weapons with. If you look at early Kemet, going back 10,000 BC, this is my specialty. If you look at the remains, the burial remains, there are no weapons in this early period. No weapons. You hear me? But with the Aryan, what you find are cutting weapons, long daggers, spears, axe-like weapons called halberds, which are axe-like with a blade. You know, you got to really be inventive in terms of cutting somebody up. You're going to axe them up and stab them. Huh? And then steel shafts, and of course, bows and arrows. So this distinguishes them, their weapons. But what also distinguishes them is their hierarchy, because in their grave sites, you find distinctions between those who have a lot and those who have nothing. Very different from African or Asian or Native American societies at this time. You will see a few of these males with all kinds of bracelets on them. You know what I mean? And also a weapon by their side. So that's showing you hierarchy. Someone, and then the others have nothing, you know, in terms of any kind of jewelry, anything like that. This is showing you there's a society where there's rich and poor. Uh-oh. And in Africa, you generally didn't have that in the early period, and among Native Americans, and in the South Pacific. Early Asian societies, later you do. And in some African societies, later you do. But for the most part, in the early period, you don't. It's a more even, egalitarian system. So central to the Aryan culture, this is real key, was the domestication of the horse. Now, it's very important to note that with the Aryans, the first means of transport was through wagoneering. That is, they had big wagons pulled by buffaloes or big animals. And they used that to move around with their game, their domesticated game that they carried and ate and whatnot. This precedes horse culture. And so many of the Africans who have this nomadic theory on white people start with horse culture. But if you look at Europe, what today is called Europe, it wasn't suitable for horse culture in many parts of Europe to begin with, but it can only occur when the horse was domesticated. And so that domestication of the horse occurs in northern Kazakhstan and eastern Ukraine. Again, Ukraine. By the way, you just saw in the news where an African has died in this war in Ukraine. These Ukrainians that weren't letting Africans out of Ukraine when this war first started. And this was somebody who had been majoring in some high level of science and was charged with drug possession, been in jail for something like 9 years. And his government is demanding to know what happened because they're saying Africans got no interest in this conflict. You know what I mean? But in this case, this was a soldier who was fighting for the Russians. And so the Russians are claiming he willingly went out here and laid his life down for a people who, according to them, he said, had given him a good education. Well, 9 years in prison. A long time for any drug offense, but of course, America has been good at that too. So it's the horse culture that develops approximately around 5000 BC that gave the Aryan mobility. And based on the nature of their culture, they could then plunder. Because just having a horse isn't going to make you warlike. Horses are peaceful animals. You know, it's what you do with the horse. The horse gives you distance in terms of mobility. And if you got certain things you want to do to people that you haven't seen before, who's got stuff that you want, well, then the horse gets used for things that the horse didn't ask to be used for, you know? So nomadism comes out of this with this horse culture that develops in the Russian, Ukraine, Caucasus regions. And so out of this develops a culture of preying on other people. To understand the preying nature of Aryan culture, then you got to go into how they define themselves. And so this is really getting into the meaning of Aryan and why I'm starting with this, because they're the first of these people who are today called European or Euro-Americans, but also their culture is definitive of the core of what you call the European worldview. And by the way, I want to say this. African Americans are really limited in our study of white people. We think that if we just know racism, we're in. Hey, we know racism. And then we like to call it white supremacy. Susan Tata. Hey, sister. Like to be on your show soon. I'm sure enjoying those pictures you send me of you and your daughter. Susan Tata, Pan-African DTV supporter. And at the same time, also support the other African-centered shows that are on that are doing some positive things. So the Aryan has a term for himself or herself. And the way people name themselves really tell you everything about themselves. And so Dr. Carruthers referred to Aryan as meaning Lord and Master, okay? Lord and Master. But it's actually, and he referred to Aryan and Arius interchangeably, but they have distinct meanings. My research shows you've got to distinguish between the meaning of Arius, A-R-Y-A-S, A-R-Y-A-S, and Aryan, A-R-Y-A-N. They're of the same people, but they have different meaning. And these meanings have to do with power relationships between them. And if you're to understand what you call the European today, you better understand that. And the point I was making earlier, one of the deficiencies in our analysis is we limit ourselves to racism. And then some who are politically sharp, capitalism. And those are both important. So I'm not knocking either one of them. But, you know, we know racism, institutional, we got all kinds of varieties of racism. We know it, you know what I mean? But you don't know the European, what's called the European, which is really the Aryan philosophy. You don't know it. A few do. The Aryan does. And so you're out here talking about you got to struggle for liberation and blah, blah. You don't know who you're fighting against, you know? And the book that I'm finishing, I'm at 658 pages on this book on Seba. It's an in-depth dive into their philosophy. Dr. Marimba Ani dealt with it in terms of Plato and Christianity. But it's a lot more than that. But her work's a masterwork for what she covered. So you need to go deeper than that. That's another reason for looking at the Aryan. Dr. Carruthers would often say to me, he would say, don't you think it would be interesting to study the Aryan mind? And he's going beyond this limited study of the psychopathic racial personality, which is Dr. Bobby Wright, which is good. And to call him psychopathic, that's good. You know what I mean? But it's necessary, but not sufficient. And I'm only giving you one part of this, the Aryan. There's a whole lot more because they've been oppressive to the world even before they came in contact with us. And you'll see even with their own people. So you have the same definition of Arius and Aryan in all so-called European languages. They all have the same definition. The Slavic, the Indo-European, the Greeks, the Romans, the British, the French, the Germans, all of them, they all have the same definition. So the first thing, and the Persians and the Indo-Aryans as well. There's a distinction between Arius and Aryan. Arius, A-R-Y-A-S, is a term used for the lords and masters who lorded over the Aryan masses. Now, this is a key point. You just can't say Aryan and Arius, lord and masters. You've got to speak to the distinction. And so Arius are the lords who lord over the Aryan masses. And you have this common definition of the meaning of these two terms in all Aryan groups. And what does Arius mean? The powerful, the masters, the commanders, the rich. Now you might ask, well, what connection does that have to capitalism? It should be pretty obvious. Isn't there a distinction between the rich and the poor under capitalism? But I'm telling you, what you're finding is when you go back to the Aryan Arius system, all other systems that come out of that end up replicating this on different levels, more complex. The more technology they get, which is basically the technology of warfare, the more damage they can do, the more land they can steal. You understand? But the key point is that underneath this is a common definition of selfhood that derives the systems that are created. So for the Greeks in the Mediterranean area, who had a heavy Kemetic influence, and we miss this because we think that's all there was. How could it be? I mean, the Greeks were engaged in constant warfare with each other. They didn't get that from the Kemites. They could never unite and form a unified state. The Kemites did. Other Africans did, because their struggle for power between them prevented that. So there's more to the Greeks than the Kemites. And so when George James says that Greek philosophy is stolen Kemetic or Egyptian philosophy, he was correct up to a point. But then after that, the Greeks had their own thing. They had Hesiod, the father of Greek philosophy. He's an embarrassment. He's not included in philosophy classes and philosophy departments. He's usually put in the humanities department. Why? Because he's kind of embarrassing. Because he had a fundamental approach to the world and how he saw himself and the Greeks saw themselves, because his thought, Hesiod, his thought was a reflection of Greek popular thought. And it's what drove them to fight each other. And in this discussion, in the second part of this discussion, we're dealing with World War II, the rise of American power. What enabled America to rise? The bloody wars that the Europeans fought with each other that knocked them out of power. What enabled Africa to rise? They knocked themselves out and nearly committed genetic genocide. One more world war of Europeans with Europeans and they're finished. You're seeing what's happening in Ukraine right now with American courage in it. You saw the French president here talking about lighten up on us so we won't freeze in the winter. Because you're going to see again in the definition of Aryanism, there ain't no compassion in it. You hear me? Huh? Not just towards us, towards them, towards each other. So Arius, first meaning, they are those who lord over the Aryan masses of all ethnic groups of so-called Europeans. And among other things, Arius means the powerful, the rich, the masters, the commanders, the rich. There's no democracy in this, by the way. And you're not living in one now. And there's very little free space in this country for free expression. I don't know if you've noticed it or not. So for the Greeks, a branch of the Aryans, they have a word. It's called ethlos, ethlos. It meant ethlos. Y'all should be taking notes. You know what I mean? It meant the one who possesses reality. Possesses reality. As if one person possesses reality. Ain't this interesting? Now, when you interpret this Greek word ethlos, it means, quote, the powerful elite who possess the reality of power, who rule over the Aryans. Get this. Aryans, see, this is why you got to distinguish between Arius and Aryan. Aryans are defined by the Arius as the bad, dirty, good-for-nothing, common, low, cowardly people. These are the same white people. Y'all get this? Oh. See why we're running around here with white supremacy. I don't use the term anymore. They're going down, baby. Yeah, they once had supremacy, but that was their term. I wouldn't even use that term when they had the power. That's white savagery. That's barbarism. Deal with that. They love that term, white supremacy. It means they're on top That's their ethos. You understand? So there's a distinction between Arius and Aryan, and the Arius are the lords and masters who rule over the Aryans, who they describe as bad, dirty, good for nothing, common, low, cowardly scum. In all Indo-European, all Aryan languages, they have the same term. I don't have time to go into it. It's sufficient to understand it. And it explains why the masses of whites, since the coming of the Aryans coming out of Russia and the Ukraine, have been in but such bad shape, in such misery. In Africa, you could go from one end of the continent to the other and not fear being robbed. Women didn't face rape. Children were not abused because they come out of this Twa culture, hunter-gatherer culture, that transforms into an agrarian culture that becomes various kinds of civilizations all over Africa. And civil means kind, good, treating people right. But what you see when this Aryan comes in is misery and suffering, except for the few. You hear me? And you need to understand that is their essence. I don't care how much they grin and skin. You know, as Dick Gregory said, they can come in the liberal form. As he said, they'll hang you. And Gregory was a good friend of mine. He got arrested at the Sheraton Palace demonstrations. And we would do a thing to commemorate the Jonestown people who had died, in San Francisco, who had died in Guyana. And he knew as much about the San Francisco freedom movement as I knew. And that's the only successful one in the North in the 60s to now. And you don't know nothing about it. I led that baby. You hear me? And so Dick Gregory, he gave up a lot for our people, money-wise and everything else. He was also cool. He had these boots he wore. I started wearing those boots. Ray Charles had some sunglasses he wore. I started wearing them. The cops said they'd arrest me if they caught me in a car with them because you couldn't see on the side. Ray Charles was blind. Well, they were hip. You know what I mean? Huh? So what does Dick Gregory say about the liberal? This is the liberal Aryan. He said they'll hang you from a low tree. The conservative Aryan will hang you from a high tree, but either case you get hung. And I'm not saying there aren't any good white people. John Brown was a good white person. We need more John Browns who get up there and join a rebellion. Even if he wanted to lead one, though, he needed to join one, but it was okay. He put his neck on the line. I respect that. The Weather Underground, I respect them. They helped free Asante Shakur, along with the Black Liberation Army, the Black Panther Party. I respect that. So if you're a radical white person, right on, do your thing. But if you want to do it right, you need to get to the people who are right. And that's us, that's people of color, Native Americans especially. So among the Aryans and the Arius, the most despised group among them is, guess who? You already know, the women. The women. In Aryan thought, particularly in Greek thought, the ideal state was existence of men without women. What kind of stuff is this? Woman's the joy of life. Yeah, it can be misery too. Just like sisters will say, yeah, she like her a good man, but hey, sometimes, I don't know. Life has its ups and downs, but the joy of it and the sorrow, it comes in relationship. And so the woman in Aryan culture was on the bottom. Her main role was to produce children. And in a fighting system, generally, most of them were in the house or doing whatever else they had to do, mainly try and give birth to male children. So the contempt of the women also explain the level of civilization, which is zero. Because if you have a society that abuses the source of life, the most sacred part of your society, then you are in a level of savagery that you should be ashamed of. But of course you aren't. That's your culture. So the Aryan view of the leaders as lords and masters, and this is also where their notion of nobility comes from, that these were essentially conquerors who, using the blood of the masses, who they describe as dirty scum, can now take on titles and huge amounts of land and lord over things. And if you want to see the mess of America, understand the mess of Britain. I'm a historian. I don't just study ancient history, I study the stuff now. And you look at how the British people were removed from the commons. They had common land that they could share. They were removed from it. And, you know, when you have Parliament taking the place of at least having the major power over the king, then what you have is the Parliament going out with armed thugs and preventing the people in the villages from having assemblies and making decisions. And a good part of America is based on thuggery. Y'all know that? I'm going to give you a little example here that most of you don't know. I raised this question with Julius Garvey, and he didn't know this either, just to show you how thuggery works. This is a side discussion here, but I'm just going to make this point. It is commonly taught that the Southern states seceded from the United States and engaged in a war of rebellion against the United States. And I would ask you, is that true? The answer is no. Georgia was the first state that opposed seceding. Virginia, which you're normally told was a state that favored seceding, they had a convention and they voted against secession, and the governor of Virginia then brought in armed thugs, which is what the Democratic Party had to keep people under control and force them into joining the Confederacy. And the same was true in Louisiana and other states. You know, Fort Sumter was fired on so that the Democratic Party could guarantee that a civil war would take place, because the Democratic Party was going out of business. But they generally used their armed forces in the South to force secession. Why did the slave masters not want to secede? Because slavery was secure. They had controlled the federal government up to 1860. They lost to Lincoln because they went too far. Some of their extremists wanted to extend slavery all over the place, and then that allowed Lincoln to get in, but Lincoln made it clear, while he didn't like slavery, he wasn't going to abolish it. And so the slave-owning class, they didn't want no civil war because they could count, and they could count bullets and manufacturing. And they knew if they went to war against the United States, slavery would be ended because the South would be defeated. So why am I saying this? Thuggery, baby. This system is based on force and violence. And in this particular case, even though, you know, the people that fought in the Civil War wanted to maintain slavery, the ones who had any sense, and there were a lot of them, they didn't want to fight in no Civil War. Why? They just keep their slaves. And the majority of people who fought didn't have any to begin with. They were poor whites, fed on the idea you're white, as if you could eat that, you know? So again, the Lord and Master syndrome there is working in that the people who control the Democratic Party imposed a war on their own people. Now, this is not common history, but there's a whole lot of other stuff you don't know. You don't know your own history because I'm not talking about the false stuff about us. I'm talking their history. Their history hasn't been told right. You hear me? So, so then Aryan, Lord and Master rulers, warriors, and then the masses who are also fighting for them, the males, who are held in contempt and in misery and suffering. This attitude that the Aryans have towards each other is extended to non-Aryans. Now, we know in Greece, a stranger had no rights, you know, could be enslaved, but they had no rights. But in general, when you're looking at the Aryan system and their move to conquest, their nomadism, their struggles for war and taking things, then when they looked at the owners of land that was not of their own, and of course for Africans, we didn't own it, we shared it, but we occupied it, it was ours. Native Americans didn't own it, they shared it. And they were saying to the whites while they were genociding them, why you have to do this? This country's big. We ain't in the whole place. You could have a whole lot of it. No, they wanted all of it, and they wanted to remove the inhabitants so they could have all of it. So when it came to the Aryan contact with non-Aryans, then they carried this same attitude, even though the Aryans were abused by the Aryans. Aryans and Aryans united in a common drive to be lord and masters of any who were not Aryans. So the black owners of land, the Etruscans, who had land in the area of Rome prior to Rome, they were treated with contempt. If we look at the Greek term for black, the term was melas, M-E-L-A-S, meaning dark-skinned, ugly, not to be trusted. And if you look at the Aryan who conquers India, they refer to the blacks who had built up this high civilization as ugly, flat-nosed people whose skin needs to be peeled from their faces. And they were put in a status below slavery of untouchability, which exists to this day. The people who founded the civilization. So these are pre-existing conditions for racism. In the case of India, it's straight out racism. Varna, caste, it means color. Whereas caste for Africans had been occupational, because in parts of Africa, you have occupational systems where a person is born a farmer. So that's what they become. But they can rise into the priesthood. That was true in Kemet. But it's not based on any racial category, and it's not based on subordinating people to a status below slavery. This is how Aryanism worked. They actually created a condition worse than slavery, which is what the untouchables in Kemet, they prefer to be called Dalits, live under to this day. Literally shoveling manure. Can't cross the shadow of a Brahmin. And the Brahmin is the highest caste created by the Africans who founded the civilization, who are the priests, you know. And the whites took over the Brahmin caste. They become the swamis who come to Europe and talk all this peaceful stuff. And of course, they occupied the Kshetra, the invaders, the Aryans, because that's the warriors. And so they took that over. But what you're seeing then is, in the case of India, full-blown racism. And in the case of the Europeans now, the Greeks and others, the Aryans who are coming from the Mediterranean and other things, pre-existing ideas that later would give rise to racism. And so Melos is one example. Now, in understanding Aryan philosophy, it's important to understand it's not morally based. There's no morals to it. And again, you get fooled, because if you're in India, then you're going to read the Gita and you're going to see a lot of stuff that sounds moral. But if you really read the Gita, you're going to see there's an Aryan thing in there that tells you something else. For example, the Gita makes it clear that being magnanimous, being generous, that's the highest quality a human being can show, is not Aryan. Even though they would say of Lord Krishna, who is this black god, but speaking white and black thought, depending on what's being said, even though he says of his leading general that he's noble because he doesn't want to kill his own family in war. This is how the Gita opens. He says he's noble because he's magnanimous, but this is not good for a Kshetra. A Kshetra can become a beggar if they don't go out and kill people, including their own family. You understand? Aryanism. Huh? You see the same thing disguised under Christianity. Remember, Constantine embraces Christianity because he has a dream in which he sees him leading an army, and in the front of the army is the flag of the cross. And so with that, warfare gets linked to religion. And it's been used ever since. Now, the African version is different, but you got to really be conscious of what you're doing so that you navigate it correctly. So the Aryan orientation of Lord and Master rules out a ethical component. There is no word in the Greek language for right, R-I-G-H-T, or ought. There's no word in it. Therefore, you don't hear Plato talking about ma'at. He can't. It's outside of the Aryan view. You hear me? As I pointed out before, for people who have watched this show before, if you study the Aryan worldview, that includes what you call Europe right now and Euro-America, it's not moral, it's teleological. Teleological. It means use-oriented or utilitarian. In other words, for the Greeks, good was if one Greek person enslaved another. It was good for the Greek who enslaved the other. Could be another Greek city-state person, or it could be a stranger. It was good. And by the way, the Greek definition of justice was when two powers were equal. Then there could be no transgression of injustice because one power would check the other. So it's really telling you it's not ethically based, it's power based. It's teleological, it's use based. So you get this, and I'm only taking one example of this because there's a lot in the linguistics in my book. I go into this. So take the word good. We've really been fooled by this one because, again, Africans were into this, even though we've been corrupted now. We got leaders who are a mess. We got some people who are a mess. Basically, ethics still prevails. It used to be a time where Black gangsters actually had ethics. There used to be a time. I mean, because they were coming out of Black culture and, they were, confined to very lowly positions. So they used the numbers thing, some of them drugs, whatever. My uncle, my father's brother, ran numbers for the mafia. And he put not my family, but he put other members in his family into business, one managing a gas station he owned and blah, blah, But he had a little ethics, at least towards his own family, But generally, Aryanism, Lord and Masterism, isn't ethically based, is not ethically based. So, good in African languages, Native American, and most Asian languages, South Pacific languages, would mean ethical, kind, just, truthful. That's what you think. But in all Indo-Aryan, Indo-European languages, in all of them, good means powerful, high station, first rank. The rich can be a no good for nothing killer because those who establish the kingdoms are killers, lead armies. And they kill men, women, children, whatever, to establish their power. So good, it means powerful, high station, first in rank, the rich. Notice I pointed this out before. Plato's Republic, he doesn't have a Ma'atan order in his Republic. His Republic is based on hierarchy, top and bottom. And the top is reason, the philosopher king. without intuition, without emotion, without feeling. So bad, on the other hand, means if good means powerful, strong, rich, high station, and then for those at the top, nobles. So bad would automatically mean low, the poor, the politically and economically weak. This is a spiritually empty conception of humanity, because this is what they have towards their own people. They're disposable. So if their own people are disposable, what do you think happens with everybody else? So Britain ruled the waves for 300 years. How did they really get that thing perfected? By sending the Scots-Irish against the Irish. The Scots were not Irish. They just got that term, Irish, Scots-Irish, because they were given Ulster that belonged to the Irish on condition that they sliced their heads off, that they scalped them. Scalping in America started with the Scots-Irish. You understand? They were the most vicious of all of the so-called war leaders who carried out genocide, murdering 90% of Native Americans. You know? So they didn't have too much feeling towards their own people, that is, Aryans, in this case, the Irish. So what do you think they're going to think about someone who they've also put in another category of being below human, Native American or African? Hardly anybody talks about the Native Americans. Hardly anybody. Hardly anybody. They're coming back, but, you know, millions here, and then a few 100,000 by 1900. You know, the slogan of the average white person was the only good Indian is a dead Indian. There was a prevention for cruelty to animals society. There was an anti-abolitionist society supporting blacks. But there was nothing for Native Americans because, you see, we didn't have the land that they wanted. We had the labor that they wanted. But in this case, the Native American had the land that they wanted and didn't want to share. Because the other thing about Lord and Masterism, there's no humanity in it. There's no feeling in it. There's no humanism in it. There's no caring in it. It's a bloodthirsty system. So there's other nuances to this that I'm not going to get into. The nuance of how the Greek system changed with the Kemetic thing, and then how the Aryan thing prevailed in that. And I've touched on the Indo-Aryan and the Iranian. I haven't gone into it all. But there are nuances within this, and then how Christianity, which is not a Western religion, which comes from the Hebrews, Semitic religion, is icing on their cake, but underneath it is Aryanism. And they've used it pretty well, using Old Testament to kind of justify what they're doing, but it's just the icing on the cake. Because the barbarism and everything else, it tells you that this idea, the meek inheriting the earth, it would, to an Aryan, Lord and Master, advocate, that means 6 feet under. You know, that's what you're going to inherit. They ain't none of the ruling class in the Western world to this day teaching their children that. And if they do that, they're going against the teachings of the group. So the ethos of the Afro-Aryan to this day is power. The greatest satisfaction derived from the Aryan is the exercise of power over others or over things. I had a friend who was an administrator at San Francisco State University. I won't name his name. I didn't get his permission to say this, so I'll just make a general reference. And he served under the president. And he served in dread every day because this president got great satisfaction of getting rid of people for no reason. And these are white people, because most of the people serving under him as deans and vice presidents and everything else, they were white. Any day, he could just chop them off. Why? Because he could. Why did they murder 6 million Jews? Because they could. In the end, why they exterminate Native Americans? Because they could. Why they enslave us? Because they had the power and they could. What's going to stop that when you have the power to stop it? You don't have to be like them, but praise the Lord and pass something, ammunition or something, that's going to prevent this stuff. Part 3, we'll deal with that one. You know what I mean? So when we're looking then at the Aryan, this ethos of power drives Aryans in every phase of history, whether you're talking about the Romans and the Greeks, whether you're talking about the rise of early Europe, mercantilism and capitalism, whether you're talking about the British who are spanning their power over the world, or whether you're talking about the United States. It's the same ethos, dressed up and called different things. But at bottom, your ethos, what makes you distinct in the world, the drive for power, is the ethos of the Aryan. That is their ethos. And they're going crazy now because they're losing it. That's a subject for another discussion. So the question is then, how does Aryanism tie into the American assumption of global imperialist power at the end of World War II? Now, by imperialist, I mean a country going out and taking other countries. It can be directly by occupying them militarily, or it can be indirectly by controlling them economically, educationally, spiritually. I mean, if there's such a thing as spiritually, on remote control, you know. So today, what you have is a global empire headed by the US. It's in trouble. I'm not going to go into the trouble today. It's in serious trouble. And you're not going to hear me up here being sad about that. My father refused to fight in World War II because he wasn't going to fight for a country that lynched his people, raped his women, you know. I had to wake up because I'd been in the Marine Reserves for 6 years. But in the course of being in the Black Liberation Movement, my eyes opened up and I discovered the real army, Black Freedom Army, that freed my behind so my behind would follow. You understand? And so what does Aryanism have to do then with the American assumption of global imperialist power at the end of World War II? Why not just locate this drive for world domination with capitalism? Why is Aryanism at the bottom of this? Because capitalism is the most arbitrary expression of power that they've been able to create. You understand? And it's enabled them to have global dominance way past the horseback stage into the stage of high technology. So one of our viewers is a specialist on this. He's talking about full spectrum dominance, which is you got your technology in space and you got it everywhere else, trying to dominate and control your own people and the world. So capitalism is a more advanced form of this lord and masterism, but essentially lord and masterism is based on the deification of power, the deification of control, without any moral restrictions or moral limits. So capitalism is an appendage that is used now, but underneath it is this Aryan ethos that drives it. It may also explain why some people who embrace capitalism in different countries take on a little bit more of a humane form, the Japanese or the Chinese. You know, you can say what's going on now with the uprisings in China based on COVID restrictions, that, yeah, well, China's not good. But China has taken 800 million people out of poverty. America's driving more and more into poverty. And that tends to be the European conception, but the worst expression of Aryanism in the Western world is the United States, that literally is delivering nothing for people. You know, you have social benefits in Europe coming out of Roosevelt's New Deal, and they added to it medical care, which you pay for. It comes out of your taxes. In Britain, you actually, if you're unemployed, the government pays your mortgage until you get a job. Have you heard of that? No, in this country, you're homeless because even if you're working, you can't afford an apartment for $3,000 a month. So I'm not denying the avaricious nature of capitalism. Not at all, you know. But it's Aryanism that drives this underneath. Now, one of the things that's important then when you're looking at America's rise to power at the end of World War II, to global power, is that America had a conception of what they defined as what was best for America. And they called this the national interest. The national interest. Now, people are supposed to go to war for the national interest. So what happens as Hitler is beginning to move across Europe and captures a good part of Europe, including France, and had he not kept driving against the British, would have wiped their army out at Dunkirk. He gives them breathing time. They're able to save their army. They lose their big equipment, but you can replace big equipment. It came through the Americans, through Lend-Lease, and eventually just given it to them. But if you lose a whole army, you're finished, you know? So when Hitler has driven across Europe prior to his invasion of Russia, powerful people in this country began to meet. And they also used a think tank for a lot of their analysis. And so when you're dealing with how power is wielded in the West and in the US, this is one of the ways they're wielded. And so the Council on Foreign Relations ended up being the primary think tank that began to think through war strategy and peace strategy, and through some serious deliberations prior to America's entry into the war and with America's entry into the war. And those think tanks, in this case, the Council on Foreign Relations, which has been the major representative, and at that time, particularly of Eastern power in this country. Their studies for how they would carry out both the war and then the post-war period, assuming that they won, because at one point that wasn't clear. This was financed by the Rockefellers. And all of the people who are being fed into the think tanks and everything else who are plotting strategy, they're coming from the East Coast, from the Eastern establishment. So when we're looking at Lord and Masterism, this is one of the things to get straight. The people who are plotting strategy are doing it in the national interest of the lords and masters, but it's being sold as the national interest. Now, at different periods, different think tanks have played roles in shaping policy for different administration. The Ronald Reagan administration, the policies for his first year in office that shaped the policies for his 2 terms was shaped by the Hoover Institute that is at Stanford. I crossed swords with them. They tried to wipe my department out. It took 2 years to whip them, you know. Condoleezza Rice heads the Hoover Institute right now, George Bush's National Security Council advisor and also later Secretary of State after Powell was not allowed to serve a second term. They basically played the role of restoring massive poverty in America. They did this by breaking unions. They did this by cutting back on programs that benefited the poor, including low-income housing, which you've got homeless people all over this country as a result of that. And as governor, Reagan had thrown the mentally ill out of, mental institutions by closing or shutting them down. So the Hoover Institute played a major role in giving this president the ideas for his administration. This president had no ideas. Reagan was functionally illiterate. They called him a cipher. If you went into a meeting, he didn't know what was going on, didn't say anything. When he gave a press conference, he always had cue cards. And then the Trump administration, it's been the Heritage think tank that has staffed the Trump administration. And the main criteria for staffing any administrative position in the Trump White House and all the administrative agencies was that they would go against those agencies and trash them, because this is an extension of the policies of the Reagan administration called neoliberalism, where everything that is government owned, as much as possible, you put it in private pockets. And so this is the role of think tanks. And so in the case of World War II, the Council on Foreign Relations is playing this role. And they are so important that they actually wielded more power than the government itself. And so what happens in the beginning of World War II, America's doing a comparative analysis, and particularly through the Council on Foreign Relations. They're doing a comparative analysis of power between Germany, because now Germany has most of Europe. This is before the outcome of Russia occurs, and the United States. Now, the truth is this, again, Lord and Master thing. If you were looking at national interests, you could conclude this, that just as Germany had control of Europe, Eastern Europe, and France, Western Europe, with the exception of Britain, was hanging by its nails. When you did a comparative analysis of the economic strengths of Hitler and the economic strengths of the US was able to take care of itself. Next to Russia, it was pretty self-sufficient in most of the materials that it needed. But because the think tanks were guided by the lords and masters who are looking out for their own interests, they conclude that it is necessary for the United States to control the United States, South America, Southeast Asia, for them to have what they considered to be comparative power to Germany, so that they could have access to those raw materials. So as a result, it meant that either Japan, that had expanded into China, was moving into the Philippines, and was moving into other areas of Southeast Asia, they had to either withdraw or they were going to go to war with them. And any thoughtful Japanese knew they had no chance of winning World War II, because what America did is put an embargo on raw materials coming from Southeast Asia to Japan. Now, some say this was designed to force Japan to negotiate. But to do that, they were going to have to withdraw from China, withdraw from every place they had gone into. And they were not going to do that. So what ends up happening is Pearl Harbor, World War II, and a two-front strategy where America is putting its main emphasis on Europe because Europe was the threat. Hitler was dumb enough to declare war on the United States, you know. But sooner or later, there was going to be a clash between the U.S. and Hitler. And by the way, Hitler was modeling his system after the United States. So if you think this was a just war, go check out what Hitler said in Mein Kampf, that he was looking at the segregationist practices that whites carried out against blacks. He was going to carry that out. And he did carry that out. The genocide towards Native Americans, he did that towards Jews, Gypsies, anyone that descended from him, you know. So America was the model for Hitler and was heavily financed by the United States. And in fact, American companies gave up all their aluminum prior to World War II to take care of the German Air Force's needs. Henry Ford was a major supporter of Adolf Hitler. You hear me? So if you think that this was just bad versus good, you understand? Think again. And one of my shows, I showed you the effort by powerful forces in this country to overthrow the government of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they had met often with Nazi representatives talking about they would rather have some kind of Hitler form in the United States. Check that show out. You understand? You don't know there was an attempt to overthrow the United States government in World War II. Smedley Butler, who was a 3-star Marine Corps general, who was asked to lead the American Legion, reported it to the Congress. They shut it down, but no one was put in jail because leading elite groups in this country backed that. So the conception of national interest was the interest of the lords and masters, those that run the country. So they wanted Southeast Asia, South America, the United States, and eventually, assuming victory in World War II, Europe under America's control. The truth is, they gave reasons that they needed this because they needed it for comparative power. They wouldn't be able to compete with Germany. The truth is they needed it so that those in control could gobble up more resources and put it in their pockets. It wasn't for the American people. So this was the first thing. In their comparative analysis, these were their objectives. And so when they go to war against Japan and Japan carries out the attack on Pearl Harbor, then that's the real basis for that. Now, the role of the Council on Foreign Relations in planning both World War II military strategy and post-World War II economic strategy is for one purpose. Of course, victory for the United States, but for world dominance and world control. So the war aims of the Council on Foreign Relations at every point was adopted by the Roosevelt administration. Why? Because they represented the people who ran the country, mainly on the East Coast, and Roosevelt did as well, coming from a rich Dutch family. You know? Now, one of the things that the Council on Foreign Relations did was integrate their thinkers who were planning both war strategy and post-World War II empowerment of America as the principal power in the world. They integrated their thinkers into the policy-making institutions of the State Department and the War Department. What this is also telling you is the lords and masters who run this country, in this case, the ruling class, it's a constant thing of them putting some of their top people into either top positions in the State Department, in the Defense Department, and in other important departments, or in second level positions where they implement policy and also help shape it. But in this particular case, given the long range thinking they were doing, they wanted to guarantee that this thinking would be integral to the operation of the State Department and the War Department and other departments as well. Now, in 1942, this is going to show you just how pervasive their power was. Council on Foreign Relations. The president of the Council on Foreign Relations' name was Norman Davis. In 1942, he, along with a leading general who they were collaborating with, American general, concluded, this is in 1942, that the British Empire, as it existed in the past, will never reappear again. The U.S. will have to take its place. You see, this, when we get to the second part of this, the decline of the U.S., this is also going to explain what went wrong in the United States. But what went wrong with Britain, with France and Germany, is they went to war with each other. And after World War I, they imposed a harsh set of peace terms, that is, the French did, on the Germans. And once a depression occurs, Hitler arises. And so you're creating the conditions for World War II, because you couldn't be magnanimous. Remember, the Aryans not magnanimous by nature. Magnanimity, are you kidding? That's why they took Nelson Mandela out of prison, because he was. And they knew he'd be nice to them. They ain't nice to nobody. You get peace and reconciliation commissions when white people do damage to you. So they can just come in and say, oh, I tortured this person, I did that person, off. You go and steal a loaf of bread or a piece of bread, you're going to jail for 20 years. George Jackson was in prison for nothing. You hear me? Huh? And all these brothers and sisters put in jail for just smoking some marijuana. I don't use drugs or anything, but what's wrong with that? And all blacks have the same percentage of drug use as whites, but we line the prisons. They don't. You hear me? So what's happening is the Council of Foreign Relations is planning for the post-war World War II world where America will rule supreme. And so when they reach this conclusion, Britain's gone down the tube, and it's pretty clear. Britain was so far down the tube that America was sending ships to South Africa and taking all the British gold out in exchange for some weapons. At a certain point, Churchill had to beg Roosevelt, don't do this anymore. Because as he said, he'd engage in World War II to preside over the dismantling of the British Empire. Well, that's what dismantled it. Two genetically genocidal wars that you waged against each other, using us as cannon fodder as well. You lost Africa, you lost Asia as a result of that. And so that's when Lend-Lease comes up, where Roosevelt comes up with this thing of, I'm going to lend something to my neighbor and we can get it back later. Yeah. And see, he's also playing a game, because his game is Britain's got to stand up to hold on. And then his game is, once they see that Russia's turned the corner, then Russia can absorb the blow. 27 million people murdered. In World War II, the Russians defeated 200 German divisions. And America only intervened through invading in France, Normandy, when the war was really over. You only had 10 German divisions left. That's what America fought. Hell, if they had not intervened, the Russians would have taken them out. You understand? So Roosevelt was playing a long game. His long game was to shed as little blood as possible, let the other side do their bleeding. But there's other things to that I'll discuss in part 2 that you don't know in terms of Roosevelt, his attitude towards Russia, a whole other thing. So the point is, America in planning during the war and after the war, they are planning for taking Britain's place. And this is the conclusion that was reached by Norman Davis, head of the Council on Foreign Relations. He said this, quote, "We must adopt a tough attitude towards our allies, and we must impose on the world Pax Americana." What does that mean? That means America is going to run the world. And you British, you French, and of course we kicked, really the Russians have kicked the Germans behind. We got half of Germany, the Russians got the other half. You're going to have to follow whatever we tell you to do. If we snap our fingers, you jump. That's what Pax Americana means. Huh. That's what it means. Some of you could expect me to go into America and the Philippines, America and Cuba, and other places where they set up colonies, Hawaii and other places. But I start here because that was them playing with imperialism. That is, Britain was still ruling the waves and supported what America was doing. They were replacing Spain as an imperial power. But now it's the world. The game is world domination. Now, what the head of the Council on Foreign Relations says is you got to have a tough attitude towards your allies, impose a Pax Americana for the purpose of the domination of the U.S. economy over the global economy, he says, to prevent a lowering of the national income. Come on now. People got their incomes raised up through the New Deal. They had WPA, World Projects Administration, various things. They got Social Security through the New Deal. You know what I mean? They got other benefits. So what are you talking about? You need global world domination so you can raise incomes? I mean, is that what you really did at the end of World War II? Are people right now, are you living on raised incomes in the United States right now? You hear me? Tell me. When the Democrats have to fight over whether or not they're going to support a $15 an hour minimum wage, that's barely $30,000 a year. You can't pay rent on that. So this whole thing about being concerned about a lowering national income, give me a break. Give me a break. Now, the key concern was that U.S. corporations and government institutions needed to control the key industrial and raw material producing countries to feed their own manufacturing system, but also so that these countries could purchase American goods. This is the main concern. Now, the Council on Foreign Relations concludes that in order to have world dominance, America must then establish global financial institutions. And so it's the Council on Foreign Relations that comes up with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. I've discussed this in a previous show. This was for the purpose of integrating the grand area, which is the United States, South America, Southeast Asia. And once Europe is in a position to do something at the end of World War II, Europe, and then, of course, it's going to be used, these financial institutions, for Africa and other parts of the world. So the imperialist ambitions of the United States was expressed by the Council on Foreign Relations in these words: that worldwide financial institutions were necessary for the purpose of stabilizing currencies and facilitating programs for capital investment for constructive undertakings, listen to this, in backward, underdeveloped regions. That means Africa, to an extent Asia, to an extent Latin America. Now, these global institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, were being used along with the creation of the United Nations to make it appear that the imperialist project was over. I mean, the direct occupation of a country, that wasn't what these institutions were doing. What they were doing was occupying you through aid that's given on terms to make you dependent. And right now, one of the countries that has handled this the best shows you the limits even when you handle it the best. My wife's from Barbados. The New York Times did a study on how the Barbadian government has handled the International Monetary Fund. And they've done better in negotiating with them than just about any other country of color. Their dollar is 2 Barbadian dollars to 1 American dollar. That's a good exchange rate. They have not allowed their dollar to be devalued, as has happened in Jamaica and in other places. But even when the head of the Barbadian government negotiates the best terms with the IMF, and the best terms were that the aid that was received in the event of any kind of climate catastrophe caused by global warming and anything else, they would not have to use IMF money for that, because in the past they would. That was a good term, you know, and now they're trying to incorporate this into general agreements from the IMF. Barbados has done well of looking out for their people, but they're still in debt. Why? One thing is, in the case of even the best terms negotiated by Barbados with the International Monetary Fund, the International Monetary Fund kept a clause in there that they had to keep 10% of the aid that they received in reserve. The United States goes into deficit spending. Nobody's required them to do that. No one else in the Western world does this. You understand? And so while they're trying to take this little money that they get from the IMF to build up their country, what's happening is there's a huge amount, 10% of that loan, they can't use. So what's that telling you? Even when you have an honest government that is dealing in the best interests of the people, this is designed to create dependency and control. So what's the application of Lord and Master? The elite, those who are the good, the strong, the so-called noble, these are terms for them. And there's a whole lot of other terms that have been, imposed on countries of color. The countries that have done well have not come under them. And so that's countries like China. They have not come under them. And America is now in decline. You think super duper is still in power. No, America's going down. That's part 2. They're already in decline. And the best proof is America. Everything's run down except for the rich. Roads are run down. Schools for everyday people are run down. And in Black communities constantly being closed for charter schools, where they're taking money out of the biggest budget that a city has, which is the public school budget, and putting it in private hands. That's a part of neoliberalism. We'll talk about that next week. America's going down the tube. People are getting poorer and poorer and more desperate. Suicide rates up. Desperation is everywhere. There's a song compared to what? And in that song, the singer sings, everything is about money. And money is the motivation that is hanging up the whole nation. Real compared to what? And so if you're rich, you're doing fine. But who's that? That's not the majority of black, brown, red, yellow, or white people. And this is a result of Aryanism. So you're seeing things going down to the ground. And a lot of young people, young black people, young people of color, particularly young black people and young Native Americans and Latinos, but especially young blacks, see no future. Some do. A significant number in college. How many can find jobs afterwards? But a significant number with nothing, no support at all. So the topic for today has been Aryanism, the philosophy that inspires United States imperialism. So I would conclude by saying that, as Amilcar Cabral said, a people's chance for liberation is measured by how different their culture is from the culture of the oppressor. Aryanism has worked against us and the well-being of people of color and a majority of whites, most of which haven't had enough sense to see it. And so it's going to take a drawing on the best of our culture to come up with alternatives to this. Hotep. So let's see what, see if you all got some comments and questions here. Yeah, Gerard, U.S. steady giving billions to Ukraine and Israel. Yeah, and not dealing with the poor in this country, you know. Coco, when nations don't comply with these institutions' terms, these nations come under sanctions, blockades. They can also face assassination. Their leaders can be overthrown. Patrice Lumumba in the 60s, Kwame Nkrumah, and a host of others. So, and basically that's the rule, period, not just for nations of color. Follow American orders or else. Coco is saying where neocolonialism comes in, which means economic control. 5-star review, they use structural adjustment loans to bring entire nations under their rule. Yeah, particularly in the 80s, that was the IMF set of rules then. And they would come in and say structural adjustment was, they would come in and say, you can't be putting money into education. You can't put money into healthcare. And they would say, the best thing is to allow private investors to come in and buy up your water. So in South Africa, water bought up by private companies, which means that the cost of water is going to be higher. Water, air, and land shouldn't be up for sale to anybody, you know? So, yeah, that's structural adjustment. And the way you avoid that is to have large units of power in Africa or in the Caribbean or wherever that, you know, can exchange among themselves. And ultimately, continental African unity will give you that. What the Chinese have going for them is a unified country, 1,400,000,000 people. And the fact that they were not occupied by the colonial powers inside the country. They were occupied on the periphery. So they face semi-colonialism. So their leadership ethos and philosophy is much more intact than ours is. It's same with their culture, whatever you think of it. They're running it. A handful of older men are running 1,400,000,000 people. And they got some problems now. You've seen some demonstration. But 800 million people out of poverty. You hear me? Christopher Sompel, IMF is the genesis of the austerity measures countries owing money are forced to impose on their population, thus causing revolts in these countries. Yeah, very true. And that usually means whatever you're giving to people for food, whatever you're giving them for basic survival, the IMF comes in and says you got to cut that. Why? To keep them dependent. And again, it's the Aryan mentality of they're in charge, they'll dictate, and misery, they'll claim. They're not doing that. They're good economic doctors. You'll do better after this. And you always end up doing worse. Bakare Sanyu, what can African people prioritize to shield themselves from chaotic dynamic conditions? A whole lot. And it depends on what part of the African world you're talking about. And the third part of this, I'm going to go into this. I've been going into this in this show on a number of different levels. So I'd give one example for Africa. It's obvious that Africa needs African unity. That's going to be hard. It's going to take time. That gives you power, but it has to be under a just system. Unity under states that are led by crooks, that'll just be a bigger union for crooks to manipulate and rip off. So it's got to be under a just system. And so one of the things that needs to happen is that the nation state model that Africa inherited from colonialism, which is again one that rewards the rich, that's the system that has been brought to Africa. That system has to be discarded. And we have to create governmental systems in which the people have the say-so. And this goes back to Trois systems that are the foundation for just societies that I've covered over and over again in this show. African people are by nature democratic. And autocracy is something that the average person goes against. But that's what the colonial model was, and that's what African independence leaders inherited. So that's one thing. Here, where you have breakdowns of families, communities, extended family communities, the destruction of neighborhoods, the murder of leaders, the imprisonment of a lot of our youth, we've been striking back. I mean, the movements that have been put forward recently that put Trump out of the White House, good thing. But now we need community revitalization and empowerment. And that comes up under our culture. And it comes up under organizing. And anything that we do to build any kind of power in our community has to be driven by our culture, which has got to have the people in the driver's seat making the decisions. If I could replace capitalism with what would it be? Modern communalism. Modern communalism. And see, we don't need to go to anybody else's system. And modern communalism, communal is sharing the air, the land, and the water, leaving it in better condition than you received it. And then that means that people have the real say-so in running their lives. Africa's run like this for hundreds of thousands of years. We don't need to go to somebody else's system who have come up with a textbook system but have no practice. We have the practice. It's updating that for 21st century realities. Let me go to some other people. The question is efficient strategy to raise collective consciousness and activity in our various communities. Some of that's going on now. There's an awakening going on right now. You young people, your eyes are opening up. You know what I mean? Your eyes are opening up. The sixfold stages to mental freedom needs to be incorporated in anything we do in terms of political or economic or social organizing to raise the consciousness of our people. So there's a lot we can do there. What can be done about the charter school, public school funding? Well, charter schools are no good. Public schools are generally not operating in your interest either because you're not controlling them. We need to control the education in our community. That's a rough, tough battle. That's a rough one. I've been engaged in those battles before, but those are the battles we have to fight. But charter schools, that's all a part of the Friedman system of neoliberalism. That's taking public money out of your pocket and putting it into private hands. And you always get a few blacks who are able to do this, so you think, oh, this is doing us good. Charter schools perform no better than public schools. And any independent black schools that go for charter school money, they're out of business in a few years. There used to be a group that coordinated independent black schools called CIVI, Council for Independent Black Institutions. Most of those schools took charter money. They're out of business now. So don't make that mistake. What's my views on Ujamaa originating from Tanzania? I worked in the Ujamaa villages for 3 months in 1973. A team of us from Pan-African People's Organization, a group that I formed that still operates in 1966. And Nyerere was right in what he did with Ujamaa. There were two periods of Ujamaa. There was the period in the 60s where the people, Ujamaa, for people that don't know, it means sharing through the family. It was Julius Nyerere's, president of Tanzania's, attempt to update communalism. That's what he was doing. And he was grounded enough to start where the people lived, in the agricultural sector, because Africa is basically agricultural. And in the first phase of Ujamaa, everyday Tanzanians picked this up and implemented it. It worked. In the second phase, when our team of people came in 73, we didn't know this was the second phase. Another thing happened. But here was the problem of Ujamaa. The problem was it was largely frustrated by the elite, the African elite around Nyerere who opposed Ujamaa, who didn't believe in the Wananchi. That's a term for everyday people. Who are the farmers? And so at each point in the 60s, they did it in after they had done a whole lot. They had a number of villages that were successful. They were, had schools, hospitals, and they were handling their own agrarian, the agricultural produce, refining it, selling it, and they were ready to move on to another level, and they sabotaged that. In the second phase that I worked in, we worked across Tanzania. I have a little book that I kept notes on, on this, and gone back and looked at it. And you had villages where people were putting in reserve capital, and that capital was going to be used for industrial takeoff. Now we say now you should use solar energy and stuff. Yes, but the point is there was a lot of progress being made, and there were different types of villages and so forth and so on. I go back in 1984 and I meet with the leading African American in Tanzania who was close to Nyerere. And he told me what happened. These villages were now ready to take off. They're going to do industrialization. These same Negroes who were around Nyerere opposed this, but he made a mistake. I'll go into his mistake in a minute. They were calling them capitalist roaders and shutting their villages down. Nyerere allowed himself to be outvoted because he believed he needed these people because they had college educations to run their country. He did not need them to run Ujamaa villages. They were not trained in that to begin with. He needed people from the villages who knew how to run the villages. And those are the people that were most successful in building villages. So that was the biggest sabotage. It was sabotage on the outside. But Nyerere got a lot of money from socialist countries in Europe to help do those villages. And Nyerere was very sincere. I met with him in 1977 outside his home for a couple hours, delivered a film on African Liberation Day to him. And I had chaired the 6th Pan-African Congress Political Committee for North America. So we had an exchange of views, and we were trying to set up something in Tanzania. Right now, Pan-African People's Organization has a hostel in Zanzibar, but we're trying to set up other things. But the point is, it was the elite that frustrated that. An elite that didn't believe in everyday Africans. Nyerere's mistake was to allow that to happen. He should have taken the portfolios for Ujamaa villages out of their hands and put it in the hands of Wananchi, people that knew agriculture, that had successful villages. Let them run that, you know. Good question, Coco. You know, on the local level, case in point, a Chicago prep school is facing the challenges of CPS determining they want to reabsorb this highly successful school geared towards education and mentoring of Black students. How do you guard against a system that pulls the rug out from under proven success? I assumed, what is CPS? I assumed that they were getting funding from the system that was doing them in. I assume that. I'd say the main way is you got to finance your own education. My organization, Pan-African People's Organization, has run an independent Black school from 72 to now. We finance it. We don't take any money from charter schools or anything else. It comes out of school tuition and out of our own pocket. And that's how you prevent that from happening. You know, don't be dependent on, Chicago public schools. Yeah, Chicago has the same problem we all have. And Chicago has a huge Black community. That community needs to be better organized because it's got a lot of conscious people. Yeah, Christopher Sampo talking about how charter schools takes money away from public schools. That's what they were set up for. ETA Brown Heron. What about these trade agreements on Black countries that are allowed to produce and export their goods? Just import items and goods from the U.S. It's an atrocity. Yeah, well, that's how they did in Jamaica. You know what I mean? In exchange for IMF loans, then they come in and they'll do things like tell a country, you can't put a tariff on your own goods. Now, America built its economy up by tariffs. Tariffs are taxes that you impose on goods coming from another country so that those goods, like say in Jamaica that had a milk industry, so you put a tariff on Europe, America, any other country bringing in milk so that milk coming from another country will cost more. That will keep your control of the milk industry. They did that on every level, you know, brought them down to their knees. They were self-sufficient. Jamaica was self-sufficient in all foodstuffs in the 1970s. Their farmers made that happen. By the time those trade agreements were finished, Jamaicans are drinking powdered milk coming from the United States, coming in real cheap, that drove good milk out of business. Who in the hell wants powdered milk when you have your own milk industry and a host of other industries? So that's all designed to take you down and keep them up. And so that's not an easy one to fight because in the Caribbean, you need cooperation between different countries. You also need good leadership, which in the case of Michael Manley, they had. And so what did they do to Manley? They imported guns. They put up a guy named Siaga, and they began a shootout. Same thing they did in Black communities. You know what I mean? So Probably Barbados' real blessing is they don't have anything the U.S. wants, so it's kind of kept them out. But the main thing is they've had good leadership, and that's what you need, good leadership that puts the people first. Fred X, what can be done about the charter school, public school funding? They give you a school choice that's to your detriment. Well, understand charter schools are to your detriment. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Christopher Sompel, the origin of the Bush family fortune was Nazi money. George W.'s granddad working for Brown Brothers Harriman as a lawyer. Yeah, very true. Coco makes sense why fascism is so popular in the U.S. right now. Yeah. And it's being backed by a sector of the rich. Hitler was financed by the Skull and Bones Secret Society at Yale. Henry Ford bankrolled Hitler. Hitler was backed by more than that. Major corporations backed Hitler, major U.S. corporations. Aloud to Zoo. Is it possible that the caste system in India was self-generated and the role of the Aryans are overestimated? Caste in India was originally, prior to the Aryans coming in, was an occupational system, and it was an egalitarian system. People lived peacefully and lived well. And so you had Brahmins, who were the priestly group, the highest group, Kshatriyas, but you didn't have a lot of warfare, farmers, some slaves, but not many, and that was it. What happens when the Aryan comes in, and you better really get this is not underestimating anything. What happens when you have a nomadic group is when they come into a highly civilized context, they usually take on the culture of that context. But what happens with the Aryan, because of the way in which they despised the Africans that they conquered, is they took over the Brahmin caste. They were already naturally fit for the Kshatriya or warrior caste. But then after a period of time, because they come in with no women of their own, no Aryan women, they marry blacks. Then after a period of time, they prohibit marriage between Aryans and the Africans, the Dalits, who get called untouchables. And so any products of marriage after that are products of Aryan and African or of the native population, they're put in the untouchable category. And so they create a category below slavery. This is not underestimated. Some of us have a commitment to this because we picked up some good things coming out of the Gita and Hinduism. But you have to understand that it is a war-oriented, misery-creating system. There was no misery in India until the coming of the Aryan. Aryan brings in misery. In fact, the Gita says, I've referred to this in a previous show, go read it. It says compassion is not the way of the Aryan, compassion is the way of the non-Aryan. You understand? They brought in misery. They didn't have it before. 5-star review, Lao Tzu. Our think tank will utilize the spiritual forces of nature, strive towards enlightenment, and go to war with the current regime that controls the earth. And I cannot say more. Okay. Well, we need think tanks, that's for sure. Shavon B. Well, thank you for your comment there. Okay. Yeah, that's very true. Star Review. Yeah, Hitler, um, he allowed 300,000 British soldiers to escape at Dunkirk. That was the British Army, basically, because he ordered his generals to stop and to regroup when they should have just moved on and wiped them out. So that was Hitler. Hitler was doing rational and irrational things at the same time. 5-star review facts. Capitalism was shaped and fashioned during 400 years of slavery. We need to practice business. Yeah, very true. The capital accumulation of capitalism came largely from slavery. Dr. Shaka, if the Chua are the mothers and fathers of humanity, then is the root of Aryan culture not Chua? Are the Aryans at their genesis not Chua who underwent transformation? That's a good question. I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to say that's a good question. S.A. Smith, this is one reason why I no longer get excited when Black people are elected into high political positions. They will have no choice but to promote the same system that is designed against them. By and large, that's true. I mean, if you're looking at Hakeem Jeffries, I think that's his name, who's been now put in charge of the House of Representatives Democratic Party in the House. He's a moderate, and he's taken stands against the progressives who make a lot of sense. So no way he'd be in his position if he was taking a progressive, let alone a radical stand. But it doesn't mean that every person that assumes office has to do that. Barbara Lee, when it came to Congress, she was the only one, but she stood up against the invasion of Afghanistan. That was like everybody was on board for that, because bin Laden is supposed to have come from Afghanistan. He's supposed to be the one that did the thing, the World Trade Center, and the others, the Pentagon. So Ron Dellums stood up on foreign policy. Adam Clayton Powell. Adam Clayton Powell got more legislation through for poor people and Black people than anybody else in Congress. So it doesn't mean that's impossible. I'm a main advocate of organizing in the streets. But if you put people into a position that has some real solid orientation, they can produce change. I had an interview on this show with former leaders of the Black United Front chapter in Kansas City. John Webster, who's now, he and his wife have moved to Ghana to live permanently. They ran a public school project for over 22 years using public school money and raising every level of achievement of Black students, including their consciousness, bringing in some of our best scholars and stuff and whatnot. You know what I mean? So you can do that. Now, in the end, you're going to have to change the system. But yeah, in the meantime, people have to survive. So you got to be able to make some changes for your people, where your people's interests come first. Five-star reviews got a hardline position there. Yeah, that's something better not expressed in public, brother. Sabrahu Kashanoga. In the 90s, there was a consensus among Black scholars that 90% of so-called African Americans were Native American bloodline. I don't know about that. I mean, we have a relationship to Native Americans, and some of us have Native Americans in our bloodline. I don't know about any 90%. Coco, yeah, she's talking about religion lacking morality. Gerard, and people wondered if Gandhi was racist, study the root. Yes, he was. These are some good comments, by the way. I appreciate them, you know. Oh, please. We have Britain in the house. My wife right now is in the UK, so right on. Oh, okay. Jimmy Taylor from Bristol, UK, offering greetings, Elder. Right on. I've been in and out of the UK now for about 45 years. United Kingdom, a lot of Black folks doing some good work there. And ETA Brown Heron, thank you for your comments. Okay. Let's go down to the bottom here and see what else is new. Christopher Sampo, do you think America is extra brutal to Haiti compared to all the other Latin American countries because of the Haitian Revolution? Yes. Yes. In some of these cities where the Republicans have shipped blacks who have come into the country, democratic cities, in some of them, they're putting leg monitors on the Haitians, and everybody else is able to go free. They're talking about opening up Guantanamo and sticking Haitians there. They have deported a huge number of Haitians under the Biden administration. And when Obama sent in relief, when they had an earthquake, he sent in the two worst people, Bill Clinton and George Bush, both of whom had messed up Haiti. So, yeah, Haiti has been on the target because of them breaking the chains of slavery, the only enslaved Africans to do so. And they need to be left alone. And we need to have a strong lobby in this country that fights for that. There's a question here about Pan-African solar energy infrastructure and need to manufacture it. I don't know. I don't think you know this, but Barbados has, I think, the third strongest solar industry in the world. Little country, Barbados, only got a couple 100,000 people. So yeah, we need more of that, you know. Brother Ugawa, I like the book, James Pooh. Yeah, Pooh is good. I read his stuff. Is Hakeem Jeffries the son of Leonard Jeffries? No, he's not. Fred X, political campaigns mention everything which is not important. Instead, infrastructure, education. Why does the public not see what's going on? One reason why more people don't vote is a lot of people do see, and they see that their needs are not being addressed. And that's the nature of the two-party system in America. Two parties, as Gore Vidal said, two parties, one wing, both right wing. You know what I mean? Yeah. However, don't miss my point. I'm no supporter of Biden, but I did support getting Trump out. And there were a lot of reasons for that. And if you don't see that, shame on you. Yeah, Brother Ugawa has a good reference here to that interview on education. Y'all should check it out. Check that interview out. Bakari Sanyu, how can Africa proceed to abolish the fractured tiny nation states previously established by the Europeans? That's a long-term work. That's not going to be easy. The fact that African independence movements were fired up, starting with the Fifth Pan-African Congress, by Pan-Africanism, that was the inspiration that fired up the movement for African independence, is an indication that there is a thought that is coming from the U.S. and the Caribbean, mainly the U.S. and Trinidad, about one Africa. That's where this idea comes from. So if Africans could be fired up for independence behind the idea of Pan-Africanism, which Marcus Garvey also helped promote, then there is a vision planted in African soil that a lot of African youth have picked up, the need for African unity. So this is a hard one. This is rough, tough, and it's ground level organizing and a lot of thought that has been put into it in the past that needs to be put into it in the future. And I think one of the things we need are just African nation states that are just. And that will serve as the formation for a different kind of African nations and provide the basis for coming together in terms of African unity. Somebody says Hakeem Jeffries is the nephew of Leonard Jeffries. Okay. Christian Sample, in all history, including ancient Kemet, has there ever been a bloodless revolution, meaning has a strong empire government been overthrown without some type of war? That's a good question. I would say that the revolt that broke out in Kemet between the 5th and the 10th dynasty, there was a lot of disruption and stuff. But I wouldn't call it a violent overthrow in the sense that it was one army against the other, but there was conflict. And some of it, I'm sure, was violent. But when order was restored, there was an attempt at least to consider the well-being of the people, because poverty had risen its head in Kemet. And they were also fighting for a spiritual right to eternal life that had been denied to them, which is a joke. How can you deny an eternal life? You know. Ed Donaldson, in your opinion, what are the chances of Black unity in the U.S.? Well, we've had unity of different types, and we need more. If you mean, are we all going to unite? No, that's never going to happen. But broad-based unity, yes. I mean, if you looked at the Black Lives Matter that exploded after a couple of serious deaths, that was Black unity on the streets. And it wasn't just black, brown, red, yellow, white. That upset a presidency. So in terms of building other kinds of unity, I think one of the key things is it's got to be tied to struggle and rebuilding communities and organizing our people. And I've been a part of some of those. I was one of 4 founders of the National Black United Front that built a form of unity. In the San Francisco Freedom Movement, we built a Black United Front called the United Freedom Movement that was made up of the major Black freedom movement organizations. And we were fighting against economic apartheid successfully. We defeated the entire economic power structure for jobs. Go look at the first show we did on Free the Mind that goes into that. And also the one that has Angela Davis on the outside. That's a presentation I made at the San Francisco main branch of the public library in San Francisco. It was 2014 on the San Francisco Freedom Movement. One of the keys to our ability to move from a movement that had a couple of hundred people in the streets that for a year, 10,000, was that we had a cross section of organizations working together and we buried our egos. This is why the groups that I've been in generally have not been co-opted by the CIA, FBI, COINTELPRO program, because we weren't doing the ego thing. And if you do the ego thing, they will play on that. They'll do other things too, even if you don't. But if you've got working unity, then and it's around specific objectives, because here's the thing about unity. Unity only comes about when there's an objective that can be achieved, that can only be achieved by a number of groups working together. That's the ground rule for building unity, because generally working with other groups is a headache. But when it's necessary, that's when there's the potential for it. But then the question is, what's the attitude of the organizers? Are they in there for the group, or are they in there for themselves? Is it for the ego, or is it for the well-being of the people? So when you bury those egos, because a lot of the counterintelligence program succeeded because of playing off of egos, a lot of it. They also succeeded for other reasons, corruption and whatnot. Nura Allah, I read somewhere the upper and lower unification of Kemet bloodless. Question. I don't think it was all bloodless, but there was not the organized overthrow that you'd find in the West, but there had clearly been oppression. And there was a period from the 5th to the 10th dynasty where people were in motion. And some poor people were taking the place of the rich, which isn't my definition of a revolution. You know what I mean? So you have a new group that's going to cause you problems. But it wasn't the bloody type that you would usually have in the West. Mildred Park says, this American political and economic system fail. How do you think it will affect the Black people of America? That's a subject that I'm going to deal in the third show, but I've been dealing with it in other ways. Coco, Dr. Shaka, did you explain how Aryans influence concepts of individuality? If not, where does that come from? Yes, in part, there was this concept of individuality there, but it's generally in the Western worldview. The Greeks, many others, perpetuated that idea. And it's usually a spiritually empty idea. The African, and it's an idea where the individual is disconnected of the person from nature and from the cosmos. The African always saw the person as a miniature reflection of the whole. And they also, because they were masters of astrophysics and other things, they understood that every part of nature is a whole and a part. And so the idea of this individual thing, which is a materialization of being human and separate from everything else, is inconceivable in the African view, in part because there's this idea of spirit and force being central to all life, which is God in the end. Infinite force outside of space and outside of time. So a part of God is within all of us. So that concept also ruled out the individual idea where the person is separate from the group and looking out for their own well-being? That's a good question. Coco, you asked some real good questions, as well as the rest of you are. BC ESG UK. Is this the time for the African family to move on the formation of a Pan-African political union that can interact with the other African entities on an equal footing? Yeah, sure. But this is hard work. You have people on the continent working on that now. Worley Smith, American blacks are so distracted by trivial that they have little incentive to study and form collective freedom here and now and in Africa. Well, yeah, that may be true of the majority, but it's not true of all of our people. And I'm saying the hip hop generation spoke up in the Black Lives Matter movement. And it interests me how silent a lot of people are about it, but I think they did some good work. And one of the things they did is they appreciated the need not to center leadership on single individuals. Sebaharu Kashan Naga, ontological analysis must be sound. Thank you. Yeah. What it is to be human. I mean, yeah. And at foundation, that's spirit. Okay. Well, I appreciate this. Wow. I see a lot of people I haven't seen before. That's good. Wasn't able to get up the banner for this show. There it is. Let me get these comments here. So what you can do is to subscribe, make sure you subscribe, hit the subscriber button, make a Cash App donation. You see it right there, Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. And pick up some of the books, Art of Leadership, Volume 1, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, Integration Trap, Generation Gap, Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. I publish my own books and will mail them to you, signed. Coco, we need to learn how to be self-governing people. Yeah, true. One level of that is running your own family and running anything you're a part of. Run it from top to bottom. I've got a question about are there life forms like UFOs running around? I don't know. So I'm not saying yes, I'm not saying no. Christopher Sampal, if the African woman is the mother of all civilization, then the Aryans, a result of Africans trapped in another climate, would be African as well, wouldn't it? Yeah, well, the Aryan part of this, I'll address that at another time. But the Aryan part and what we discussed, I've discussed. Ra Moses, the biblical order of royal priesthood are actually the teachings of Tahuti, which we should understand and implement in our spiritual and ritual exercises. Okay, that appears to be it. Oh, I got permanently suspended from Twitter. Are you on Facebook? Yes, I'm on Facebook. And subscribe there, but make sure you subscribe to YouTube. Lama Bay, thanks for the compliment. Okay. Well, I see y'all got something out of this. And understand this. This show's been growing thanks a lot to Brother Ogawa. And then we've been getting help from Hoppy, which is a very good show that you all should subscribe to. But they got me on a low altar rhythm. You understand? That's why I haven't been drawing more people. This is a quality ass show. I know what it is. I bring on the best people and then I do my best. And I've been doing this for 63 years. So it's not a joke, So what you can do is recruit people to subscribe to the show. what you can do is post. When you see an ad for a show, which comes up every week, post it. Post it on Facebook. Post it on any of the sites, Instagram, wherever. You know what I mean? Post it, because I understand the game that's going on, and we've been able to up our viewers, but we could do better. So help us out, What creates genius in African people? Well, a whole lot of things. This book that I'm working on now, on SEVA, which is a replacement system for education, goes into that. And I say we have mastery systems that help us with that. So I want to say, Hotep, I've enjoyed this. Nura Allah, will you do a show about the African Great Mother Principle? Yeah. I'd like to build up a greater followership for that, but yeah, and I would suggest that people read it. It's considered a classic, according to Dr. Obenga, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. He defines as a classic, and he said that the term that I use for African families, which I call not matrilineal, not patrilineal, not matriarchy, not patriarchy, but twinlineal, meaning you're descended from both mother and father, grandmother, grandfather. If God is he, God is she. He said that term should be in the dictionary. So yeah, that's my most important work. It took 15 disciplines to write. The book's in 10-point font. It's actually about 700 pages long. It came out the same time as Marimba Ani's book on Urugu. She deals with the unjust society. I deal with the just society. We both presented our books at ASCAT, Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, in 1995. 1,000 people were there. So you should check the book out, buy it. It's listed here. And we'll mail it to you, signed. So I appreciate all the comments. Show some sharp people. And you should enroll in the 6-fold stages to mental freedom. We're getting close to 40. We're going to need 40 people to take part in that. It's for a year, twice a month for a year. And it's taking people through the stages of consciousness and development, tied to work you're doing in the community. So you just send me a message saying that you want to enroll, and we put you in the file. And then once we get close to that number, you'll know about it. Rob Moses, that I received the email he sent me. I'll check and see. Okay, Hotep, everybody. I enjoyed this, and I appreciate your interest. Thanks a lot.